We recently learned that Pokémon Scarlet and Violet is now Japan's biggest selling Pokémon title ever, eclipsing even the beloved original titles. Is this a sign of the strength of the franchise, or is Pokémon actually underperforming given the huge strength of the Switch and the famed Switch effect? And is the success of a game so buggy that Nintendo apologized for it out of the gate the last kind of reinforcement Game Freak needs? Settle in for a deep dive on Pokemon's sales figures. Now, I should say by way of disclaimer that I am a very casual fan when it comes to the Pokemon end of Nintendo's business. I enjoyed Pokemon Blue back in the day, although I was a little too old for the first wave of Pokemania to really capture my heart. After that, I kept a weather eye on the subsequent games, but they weren't instant purchases for me. I really looked forward to Let's Go, a game with luscious, modern graphics, a cool Pokeball controller, and yet one that mainlined Gen 1 nostalgia, and yet with a casual Go fan gloss. But whereas Link's Awakening seemed to outgrow its Game Boy original form factor, this still felt very Game Boyish and not what I was hoping for, and when Sword and Shield turned out to have only limited open areas, and rather dull and muddy looking ones at that, I voted with my feet and skipped that generation, a decision made all the easier by the absolute ton of other great games arriving on Switch in 2019. Then in 2022, I was very excited for Legends Arceus, and I was still in the midst of enjoying that game when they announced Scarlet and Violet. And while those games looked awesome, bright, open, modern, frankly, it left a really bad taste in my mouth that they didn't even let Arceus have a month in the sun, and the negative buzz around the game's quality made me decide to skip that one too. Unlike Sword and Shield, I am actually very tempted by Scarlet and Violet, as they do look like great fun, but since I understand very little has actually been patched by the developers to improve the experience, and I have loads of other games that I want to catch up on, hello Xenoblade Chronicles Trilogy, it's not something I expect to get around to particularly soon. Now, I don't usually share commentary so much as stick to facts and details, but in this case I really wanted to illustrate something. By any metric, I should be buying most Pokemon games. Probably 80% of the new first-party games that come out on Switch I buy. Some are franchises I've loved for years, like Zelda and Advance Wars. Some I've no prior experience with, like Another Code or Famicom Detective Club. And several I expect to like, but I do get that bit of nervousness ahead of a release that maybe the new one just won't be as good as I remember. It should not be difficult to sell me a Pokemon game. And yet of the, 8 retail Switch Pokemon games, I've purchased 3, the third being the somewhat anemic Detective Pikachu Returns. Clearly, not all games are for all people, and the Pokemon Company have done very well indeed by any sane measure. Almost irrespective of the console it releases on, Pokemon scoops the pool. On 3DS, Pokemon X and Y sold 16.73 million, and Sun and Moon sold 16.33. On DS, Diamond and Pearl sold 17.67 million, and Black and White 15.64. So not only did Nintendo Switch buck the trend in terms of absolute sales, where on last report Sword and Shield held steady with 26.44 million and Scarlet and Violet had 25.69 million sold, but they're also well on course to buck the trend that the second game sells worse than the first, as there's a very decent chance that Scarlet and Violet could yet overtake its predecessor despite having an initial reception that was, to say the least, rather troubled, with Nintendo of course being forced to apologize. Presumably the Pokemon Company and Nintendo should be feeling really very smug. But look at it this way, the Switch install base is twice the size of 3DS's, and these games launched after Pokemon Go took the world by absolute storm in 2016. Whereas on 3DS, the second, third, and fourth best-selling titles were all Pokemon, and on DS, the fifth, sixth, and eighth were. On Switch, the only two to chart in the top 10 do so at 6th and 7th. Now this is still very respectable and suggests that while on 3DS the lower market penetration of that console meant that there were a larger proportion of dedicated Pokémon fans on Switch and DS, the games occupy roughly the same level of popularity in the top 10. It's also fair to say that 3DS and DS never had to compete with the mainline Super Smash Bros., mainline Zelda, and mainline Mario. The 3DS Super Mario 3D Land and Super Smash Bros. For 3DS probably didn't quite set the world ablaze like their Wii U counterparts. And maybe the pandemic had a good hand in Animal Crossing New Horizon leapfrogging Pokémon. And yet, when we look back to the DS, the titles that pipped Pokémon were mostly real one-offs. Nintendogs was a packing game, and Brain Age was a mini phenomenon. Then there were the always popular Mario and Mario Kart titles. But now Pokémon lags Mario Kart, Animal Crossing, Super Smash Bros., Zelda, and 3D Mario. In terms of core Nintendo franchises, Pokémon hasn't improved as much as those others. And that's before you consider that comparing the Switch numbers to the handhelds isn't quite comparing like with like. Sun and Moon was superseded within a year by Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, whereas the Switch Pokémon games use DLC to double down on the main titles. So at this point you might be saying, so what? It's still doing well, incredibly well, and that fact would be churlish to deny. Also, let's be honest, Pokémon is making a huge amount, and whereas the likes of Zelda, Mario Party, 2D Super Mario Bros., and in the past 3D Mario have all showed significant drop-offs with the second title on any given console, Pokémon games rarely, if ever, have much of a difference in terms of performance. This lack of any significant audience attrition, potentially the opposite with Scarlet and Violet, can only be a positive thing for the resilience of the audience base. What would the alternative be anyway? Personally, I would love to see a Pokémon game that is to Pokémon what Breath of the Wild is to Skyward Sword. A dramatic opening up, more tactile, more developed and graphically beautiful as well as being huge in scope. Legends Arceus isn't perfect, but certainly had a strong appeal to me for all these reasons. And I know the Pokédex is a source of some consternation, and I completely get the argument for limiting the number of Pokémon in each game, but I do feel that if Super Smash Bros. Ultimate can include everything from reportedly 225 different franchises, it's not unreasonable to expect the Pokémon Company to offer the same. I do agree that getting on for 1,000 Pokémon is a little much for most players, but frankly, I've never come close to catching them all anyway. Perhaps a post-game mode where the other Pokémon become available would work as a balance between not scaring people off and yet offering hardcore fans the opportunity to catch them all. But here's the thing. I'm not the core audience, and it's not necessarily the case that trying to rock the boat would reap outsized rewards. In fact, Legends Arceus is a great case in point. They tried something different, something amazing, and it did well, but notably less well than the mainline games, with just 14.83 million copies sold by the end of the 2022-2023 financial year. Still amazing, and perhaps it would have helped if they didn't cut its knees out from under it within a month by announcing Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, something I completely expected by the way, but that didn't make me feel any warmer towards the announcement. And of course, it's not a mainline generational Pokémon, but it doesn't suggest that there's a huge untapped spring of Pokemania waiting to explode out. Even if they spent 6 years indulging me and creating something unimaginably perfect, would it really be better as a financial move than making 2 decent crowd pleasers which would probably both sell incredibly and spearhead a whole suite of new merchandise? Polling company YouGov identified in 2021 that Pokémon was the franchise that young consumers had heard the most positive buzz about. Now, to be fair, this polling was conducted a few weeks before the launch of Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, so you might expect there to be some hype around this, but nevertheless, the fact that it topped out Super Mario Bros., Minecraft and others was quite notable, although I hadn't realised that The Sims was still a thing, so I'm a little bit cautious about this data. Additionally, a company called Solitaire Bliss, for reasons best known to themselves, ran some kind of survey on Pokemon, analysing 2,700 words and phrases for Pokemon and running a poll with 900 people. The data seems pretty ropey to say the least, as I can't see that it's anything like a representative sample, but then again, Solitaire players aren't a natural overlap with Pokemon, so it's not like they went down to a Pokemon fan site and ran a poll. Still, they assert that over a third of Americans still play Pokemon video games, with 1 in 10 playing Pokemon Go. And for this to be true, there would need to be almost no crossover audience between the various Pokemon games, so I do think that's unlikely. However, they identify that 80% started playing as children, with the average age being 13. 51% thinks the games are overpriced, but of those, 53% buy them anyway, and yet 41% were planning to buy the newest game, which at this time was Scarlet and Violet. 40% think the games got better with each release, while 65% would rather play the original games Red, Blue and Yellow in the States. This latter statistic feels more telling about the audience surveyed. I can't imagine many 8-year-olds being on a Solitaire website, and if the survey field was a little wider, I would expect the originals to get less attention. Still, what this doesn't convey is a tremendous excitement about the future, but rather a sense that the games are basically fine and yet still compelling enough to keep buying. It also shows that the company is still in a very good position at drawing in young audience members and at upselling the merchandise, with 72% of respondents owning Pokemon stuffed animals and even 13% owning bags, purses, and another 13% owning a Pokemon hat. These numbers may lack for true accuracy, but they are at least indicative that a lot of merch is shifting off the back of Pokemon. So, where does the Pokemon Company go from here? There is a risk, of course, that if the quality dips for too long, people will eventually jump ship. But there's no sign of that yet. On a bike, if you slow down too much, you're more likely to fall than if you keep moving, and I kind of feel that Pokemon is in this situation. Yes, theoretically, they could pump the brakes and take their time to craft a real masterwork. Do a Zelda, take 6 years and really do it right. But to a child, 3 years is forever, and 6 is, well, it's a minimum of a third of their childhood and possibly all of it up to that point. I think there's an argument to be made that for the child audiences, the regular event of a major new Pokemon game is so important that waiting so a few adult fans can get less sniffy about bugs seems like a really minor concern. This audience is real, and while they may not be as vocal, the evidence suggests that they're committed. Of course, there are lots of polls online which suggest Pokemon fans are getting older, but I don't know many 7-year-olds who are answering polls on GameFAQ.com. Nintendo has the most reliable data and mentioned in their March 2017 financial review that the ratio of players in their 20s and 30s has risen from Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon compared to past Pokemon titles. But there are no hard numbers on this, and frankly, it shouldn't be a surprise that if you wait 3 more years, more of your loyal audience push into an older age category, which is going to draw those averages up. They also still note, of course, the high penetration of Pokemon Go into the 20s to 30s market, which probably also had a big crossover effect. Still, even Nintendo can't give fully accurate data on the age of its player base. It's not like you have to scan in your passport to start playing a game, and while Nintendo has a good amount of data on its players, younger gamers are far less likely to be represented, as they may play on adult accounts or simply not give full information. And I'm not saying that young players are likely to be less discerning. The fact that the sales of these games is so robust suggests that they are seeking this series out deliberately. What I am saying is that I don't think the metrics that many more general gamers value are of such significant interest to the core base of younger Pokemon players. Consistency of releases, the designs of new characters, and probably integrations with other Pokemon content such as the card games, these strike me to be far more important to that audience segment. This is why I've always felt that the Pokemon Company are more likely than not to stick, wherever possible, to their very rigid cadence of releases, even despite every indication being that they will take a little bit longer this time. Now, I agree in this case, I'll probably be wrong. While I will one day deep dive the Pokemon Company a lot more, I don't necessarily have the same feel for it as other companies I've been following a long time, and so I put a lot of stock in audience feedback, which does tend to suggest that 2026 is a much more propitious time for the next generational Pokemon. Nevertheless, strategically, I don't think a Nintendo strategy of substantially longer development times leading to, usually, significantly more high-quality titles is necessarily the best for the audience, even if it would personally be something I and many game reviewers may appreciate. It may even bolster sales significantly to do this, but they would need to increase those sales very substantially to make up for the lost sales of having a 3-yearly cadence, so that's potentially no great win. I guess my ultimate hope would be that Game Freak can diversify and expand to the point where it has even more concurrent teams. Currently has the team that worked on Let's Go and Legends, and as well the mainline generational Pokemon team. An ideal situation to aspire to, it seems to me, would be to have 2 generational teams alternating and working on games on a 6 or 7 year sliding schedule. This should be possible, and financially I'm not sure it would even be a major problem. Pokemon titles have massive numbers of people working on them, but a lot of these are brought in externally to quickly bang the games out to a tight deadline. Ilka supported heavily on Scarlet and Violet, for example. If each game had half the number of people but they had twice the length of time to work on it, they would have more ownership, more experience, more of a voice and a stake, and one imagines the level of quality would only improve. This has not been possible in the Switch era, when the ramping up of scale to go from 3DS games to full HD and open world extravaganzas has been immense. But Pokédex scribbles notwithstanding, I'm not sure Pokemon needs to ramp up drastically in terms of scale, but rather in terms of the quality and finesse of its products. And so it should be possible with proper long-term planning to give it the flexibility to do just that as we enter future eras. It should also be a source of comfort to Nintendo that while a rising tide does lift all boats, the Pokemon games remain financially buoyant even in the choppy waters of the 3DS era, just as they do in the better harbour of the Switch. While I'm sure they hope that the dark days of the mid-2010s are never repeated again, that level of diversification is something I am sure they consider very useful. And so while the Pokemon Company operate quite differently from Nintendo, and perhaps there are reasons from a creative and quality viewpoint to wish that more of the Nintendo sense of quality above all rubbed off on them, I think it's valuable that they are operationally independent and can approach the Pokemon series with their own unique take and unique approach. Thank you so much for watching, thanks to my Patreon subscribers, and please do check out these videos on screen. I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.